unabashed,
the most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives, a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grant Tamasha, a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. I'm your host, Milan and Sukumar. On February 1st, India's Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman presented her 8th budget of the Modi era. This year's budget was tabled at a precarious economic juncture for India and for the world. India has been challenged by slowing growth, persistent inflation, and global uncertainties motivated in part by the return of Donald Trump to the White House just a few weeks ago. So how has the finance minister approached this delicate moment? What are the government's priorities for the coming fiscal year? And has it made the tough decisions that could revive underlying animal spirits? To discuss these and many other questions, I'm joined on the podcast this week by Sukumar Ranganathan, editor-in-chief of the Hindustan Times. Longtime listeners will know that Sukumar has regularly appeared on the show to share his insights on India's political economy with us. We are pleased to welcome him back to the show for the first time since last April. Sukumar, welcome and thanks for taking the time.
Always a pleasure to be here, Milan.
So let us start, before we get to the budget itself and some of the fine print, by talking about the economic backdrop against which the budget was tabled. How would you kind of set the table for us? Describe the general economic mood in India before the finance minister showed up in Parliament.
There were two aspects to the general economic mood. One is the global overhang, because the Indian economy is pretty much integrated to the global economy now, and the Indian market is fairly linked to international markets. So anything that happens in the world affects India, and the global economic scenario is, what it is. The global economy is not in the best possible place. There are significant geopolitical concerns. The return of Donald Trump to the White House has stirred things up a bit, to put it conservatively. And then there is the domestic economic context. The domestic context best summed up by two numbers. One is the expected growth for 24-25. India follows the April-March financial year, so our current financial year will end in March. It will end on March 31st. And the Indian economy is expected to expand by 6.4%. Which is lower than the 8.2% at which it expanded in 23-24. Worse still, in the second quarter of the year, because the latest number we have is for the second quarter, which is the July-September quarter, the Indian economy expanded by 5.4%. 5.4% was the lowest in 7 quarters, I think. The 6.4% growth that we will see for the entire year is the lowest in 4 years. So it's not exactly a great place to be in, especially given the context. And I have to say this because 6.4% to anyone from an OECD country, to anyone sitting where you're sitting, will seem like a huge number. But the economic survey, for instance, which is a state of the economy kind of report that the chief economic advisor of the Indian government puts out a day before the union budget, it said that India needs to grow its economy at 8% a year if it wants to reach developed country level of per capita incomes by 2047, which is India's centenary of independence. So 6.4%, 8%, you can see the gap. And that's really the context in which the budget was presented. It was very clear that something was needed to revive the economy. Since the pandemic, the Indian government has been very, very fiscally prudent. They were prudent before the pandemic. Of course, during the pandemic, like all other countries, India too spent a lot. But not on fiscal stimuli. It spent much more on other measures. But since then, India has spent much of its budget on capital expenditure. hoping that government spending on capital expenditure will crowd in private investment and boost the economy, hasn't really happened to the extent that the government hoped. Meanwhile, consumption demand was flagging, and that was something that probably needed to be revived ahead of the budget, and that was the context.
So before we get into the specifics, and there's a lot there to talk about, just step back for a second. The finance minister tabled this budget on February 1st. When the papers were printed on February 2nd, how would you say this budget was received? I mean, you've published a lot in your paper. I'm sure you've devoured a lot of analysts from other outlets. What would be a quote unquote fair and balanced assessment of this budget?
I think it was universally welcomed. And the reason why it was universally welcomed was because the general consensus was that it had done enough to revive consumption demand, that it had not lost its focus on capital expenditure, and that it continued to remain fiscally prudent. The finance minister exceeded her fiscal deficit target for, and when I say exceeded, I mean in a good way. I don't mean she breached it. She actually brought it down, both in 2024-25, and the estimate for 25-26 is lower than what was expected. Most analysts expected India to have a fiscal deficit of 4.5% in 2025-26. The budget puts it at 4.4%. So she scored on all three parameters, and I think the general consensus was that it was a good budget.
So let's just maybe stick with the fiscal outlook for a moment. As you just pointed out, the budget kind of plows ahead with fiscal consolidation. This has actually been a kind of a perennial characteristic of this government, is that it has prioritized macroeconomic stability, fiscal prudence. How is the government able to meet its fiscal targets, given everything else you just mentioned, right? Slowing economic growth. Are its assumptions mathematically sound?
Well, in the current year, it's managed to meet its fiscal deficit target primarily because the spend that was planned for didn't really materialize. For a few months at the beginning of the financial year, everyone was caught up with the national election, and I think the implementation of some of the projects lagged. So we didn't end up spending as much money as envisaged. The second part of it was that some of the schemes took a lot longer to plan out. For instance, there was the internship scheme that was announced in the July budget. It's just going through its second pilot, and a fair amount of funds has been put aside for it in the current budget. When I say the current budget, I mean the budget for 25-26. So some of those schemes took a little longer, and that probably helped them meet the fiscal deficit target. But the math of the budget is reasonably sound. The only number, if one really wants to quibble, the only number that one would have a problem with is the assumption that has been made on nominal growth, given the fact that inflation is low and set to go lower. There might be some analysts, and there are some analysts who believe that this assumption is a little more bullish than it should have been. But other than that, the math is reasonably sound.
When you were talking about the various parameters by which people have assessed the finance minister's performance, one of the things you flagged, in addition to the kind of fiscal outlook, was stoking consumer demand. And I think this is perhaps one of the biggest takeaways of the budget is the tax relief that the government has provided the middle class. Tell us a little bit about what the government announced. And, is this essentially an overdue or belated recognition that India does indeed have a serious demand side problem?
Well, the Easier question to answer is your second question. Yes, India does have a demand side problem, and it has had one for quite some time. The fact that we've continued to spend money on capital infrastructure is largely because we believed, or the government believed, that that was the main driver of economic growth, given the fact that demand was lagging. And most economies, and that includes India, saw a post-pandemic bump in consumption. After COVID, everyone went out and there was this surge in consumption. But that ended. And I think in India's case, that ended round about sometime in 23, 24, early 24. And since then, you've seen this consistent demand side problem that's been there. Now, what has the budget done in terms of tax changes? It's done two things. The first one is that it's offered what's called a tax rebate or a discount. So this is a rebate or a discount on whatever tax you pay. And the second thing that it has done is that it has redefined the tax slabs. Tax slabs in India are, people who earn different salaries pay tax at differential rates, and so the salaries are the income is put in slabs, and based on that, you're taxed. And both of these together have meant that both changes together have meant that India has given out around 1 trillion rupees in tax back to consumers. So, the money, that's 1 trillion rupees of money that's hopefully going to come into consumption, or so the government expects.
This is George Perkovich. For 3 decades, the Carnegie Nuclear Policy Conference has helped government officials, journalists, NGOs, industry, scholars, and students to debate and understand the latest risks and possible pathways to managing them. This year's conference will be held on April 21 and 22. Registration is open, but seating is limited. For more information on the program and to register, go to carnegieendownment.org/NPC2025.
Sajid Chinoy, in a piece that he wrote for the Indian Express, in his kind of budget wrap-up, had this to say. He said, India doesn't have the space for a fiscal stimulus in the coming years. What we need is a reform stimulus to crowd private investment in. Tell us if, have we seen any indications in this year's budget, or perhaps what's to come after the budget, that such a reform stimulus is in the offing?
Easier said than done, right? I think all commentators say this, including people who write for us. There are many analysts in our own newsroom who pretty much said the same thing. Both the economic survey and the budget, interestingly enough, do mention this. The economic survey speaks about deregulation. And the importance of government getting out of the way. I think that was the exact wording in the economic survey. And if you go through the budget speech of the finance minister, you will see that there was one entire section under the investment category when she was speaking about investment, that the finance minister spoke about deregulation and setting up a committee to look at all non-financial regulations and to see what changes needed to be made in those. Separately, one for financial regulators, a new version of for want of a better term, ease of doing business bill. We had one such law that was introduced previously by the Modi government. It was called the Jan Vishwas Bill. which decriminalized a lot of offenses. And you know, in India, many kinds of corporate misdemeanor or many kinds of even minor violations of industrial laws previously were criminalized. So those were decriminalized. I think 183 were decriminalized by the first version of the bill. And the finance minister promised a second bill that would decriminalize around 100 more. So yes, there are efforts to make it easier to do business, but it's important to acknowledge the fact that a lot of these regulations are also state-specific. For instance, India passed 4 labor codes, which pretty much rewrote the entire gamut of labor laws in this country. And if you speak to any analyst, the consensus will be that labor reform is one of those things that India desperately needs at this point in time. And these 4 codes pretty much do that. But labor is the states have to concurrently adopt these and pass their own laws related to these. And some of the states have not done so. So I think there's been some effort to chivvy them along and push them to do that. In fact, just ahead of the budget, the labor minister met with his counterparts from the various states to try and figure out where this particular piece of reform was held up. So that's really the challenge. How do you get the states to play ball when it comes to some of these critical non-financial sector reforms? Financial sector reforms are easier simply because you have one regulator. You don't have multiple regulators. But just to give you an example, every state has its own labor inspector, its own factory laws. Every state has got its own drug regulator. And more often than not, these regulators of the states do not talk to each other, and they do not talk to the central regulator. So, for instance, in drug control, you have no central database, for instance. So these are all challenges that India will have to address.
You know, every budget that's ever been issued by the government, and this is probably true of any government, has some political objectives in mind at the time of its crafting. And writing in the Hindustan Times, your colleague Roshan Kishore noted that the budget has 3 political objectives in mind this year. The first is that it sends a clear message to the BJP's core middle class, its urban base, that it's looking out for its interests. The second is that it tries to consolidate the BJP's advantage among the non-poor, particularly in the Delhi region, which is going for local elections on February 5th. And third, it tries to build a strong narrative for the BJP ruling alliance in the state of Bihar, which will go to polls towards the end of the year. Tell us, in your mind, what did the budget do to try to signal to these various groups?
I think Roshan pretty much summed up everything that the budget did. For instance, it was extremely important that a message be sent to the middle class that the government would respond to their concerns. And it's a little bit more complex than simply the fact that the middle class is the core support base of the BJP. Over the last decade, welfarism has emerged one of the strongest political platforms in this country, irrespective of which party is in power. So across states, you find a variety of welfare schemes that have been launched. Most of these are cash handout schemes. Some of these are cash handouts for poor women. Some of these are cash handouts for unemployed young people. And whether it's the Congress in Karnataka or the Jharkhand Mukti Morcha in Jharkhand or the BJP in Madhya Pradesh or the alliance of the BJP, the Shiv Sena and the Nationalist Congress Party in Maharashtra, everyone announced these ahead of the elections, and many of these governments have gone ahead and implemented these. Now you need money to fund these, and the feeling among the middle class was that they were not the recipients of any of this largesse, and that some of this was actually being funded by their contribution to tax. Which is not entirely inaccurate, because as again, you are, as some of my colleagues have reported, the contribution of income tax, not just corporate income tax, but also personal income tax to government revenues has been increasing. For instance, the personal income tax contribution to tax revenue to GDP was around 4% last year, I think. And I think the feeling among the middle class was that they were funding all these schemes and not getting anything in return. And that needed to be addressed. And I think that is one of the things that has been addressed.
I just want to go back for a second and ask you about the economic survey, which, as you pointed out, is the government's flagship annual economic policy statement. In this year's iteration, it made a big pitch for deregulation, getting the government out of the way of business so that the so-called trust deficit between the government and Indian capital, Indian entrepreneurs, can be bridged. Now, you mentioned before that the budget did go some direction towards doing this. Tell us a little bit more about what concrete steps the finance minister announced this year.
Well, like I said, she announced 3 or 4 things that would specifically deregulate various areas. The first one was she announced that the government would set up a committee that would look at all non-financial regulators and try and see which one of the laws needed to be tweaked or scrapped. She also mentioned a similar move for financial regulators. She mentioned that there would be a new version or a new iteration or a new edition of a ease of doing business bill, which decriminalizes several offenses. And like I mentioned, in India, a lot of minor corporate violations or industrial violations attracted jail time in some cases. They were all criminalized. So in the first iteration of the bill, the Modi government decriminalized around 180 offenses, and this time she's promised to decriminalize around 100. So these are significant steps. Are they adequate? Perhaps not, because the larger issues are issues like labor reforms. And that pretty much also highlights the challenge that the government faces, because this government was brave enough to actually try and reform labor laws, which no government in India tried to do. And it passed 4 labor codes. But because of our strong federal setup, these are now laws that have to be ratified by the states, which have to then adopt them. And that's not really happened. So the challenge is to get the states to also do this, even as the center does it.
Hey, Grant Tamasha listeners. Thanks for listening to the podcast. Putting this show together each week is a labor of love, but it takes a lot of work to put out a great show every week. If you'd like to support the work we do at Grant Tamasha, please visit ceip.org/donate. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or on your favorite podcasting platform, so you'll be the first to know when a new episode rolls out.
I want to kind of pivot here to a slightly different topic, which has nothing to do specifically with the budget, but more the kind of economic context. We've seen a flurry of developments coming out of Washington with respect to tariffs announced by President Trump. On Saturday, the White House announced a 25% additional tariff on imports from Canada and Mexico, a 10% additional tariff on imports from China. In just the last 24 to 48 hours, it looks like the tariffs on Canada and Mexico have been temporarily paused, although the Chinese tariffs are expected to continue. Assuming for a second that, they're not direct tariffs placed on India, but rather on China and perhaps just this general sense of unease or uncertainty, how do these impact India's bottom line? Or if I could kind of maybe phrase it a slightly different way, is India resilient enough to sort of weather this kind of tempest in the trade world?
India's exports, put together, merchandise and services put together, were around $800 billion. So, yes, it can weather global uncertainty, but it's very, very important to acknowledge the fact that exports is one of the key drivers of the Indian economy. If you go back in time and you look at the period in the first half of the 2000s, when the Indian economy really expanded rapidly, you will find out that a lot of that growth was being driven by exports. So it's very, very important to focus on exports. In fact, much like investment, exports was another area that the budget focused on. And the finance minister announced measures that she expected would make Indian exports more competitive. But the fact is, if there is global uncertainty over trade, which is what the US's tariffs will result in, it's going to affect everyone. Sure, if Chinese exports to the US become more expensive and become uncompetitive, India may benefit to some extent by shipping those particular products to the US. But the fact is, at the end of the day, if countries are busy levying tariffs on each other, it's going to be very, very difficult to keep track of where one gains and where one loses. And it also makes the economic atmosphere globally a little fraught with risks. And I think India realizes that. Everyone would like to avoid a global tariff war.
One other thing that I want to ask you about is something that, has kind of been this, I feel like a subterranean storyline, which has to do with monetary policy. And it's been prompted by a series of pieces written by two well-known economists, Arvind Subramanian, the former chief economic advisor, Josh Feldman, senior IMF official, the IMF's former resident representative in Delhi. In these series of pieces, they have sharply questioned recent actions taken by the RBI. And to just kind of sum up for our listeners, they've essentially argued that the Reserve Bank of India, the central bank, has quietly moved to peg the rupee to the dollar. This has been a costly move, which has foregone exports. It's led to inappropriately tight monetary policy as growth has slowed down. It's led to a loss of upwards of $200 billion in reserves, and finally invited unnecessary speculative pressure. I'm wondering, if you agree with this narrative, if you think it's a compelling case, and if so, why do you think it's not gotten much attention? Because we hardly see stories about this, in the media.
That's easily answered, right? I mean, I think most people's knowledge of foreign exchange is strangely conflated with a sense of national pride and as a result, you are unlikely to see serious discussion on this. I remember reading the paper that you refer to, and I think the argument is a valid one. But it's going to be. You also have to understand that while you may not have seen coverage related to that in the media, what you repeatedly seen in the media, including, let's take today's papers for instance, all newspapers had the fact that the Indian rupee was now trading at 87 to the dollar on page one, and I think a depreciating rupee would definitely make Indian exports more competitive, but I just think that no government would want to go out and say that simply because it would be politically not such a smart thing to do. It would, like I said, everyone conflates this notion of currency strength with national pride, and to be fair, it's something that the BJP did when it was in the opposition, right? So,
I was reading this newsletter over the weekend by Pranay Kotastane of the Takshashila Institution and his co-author this past weekend, and it was also reflecting on the budget, and they had this sort of provocative line I just want to read out, which says, "I have a sneaky feeling that for the past 6 months that the Prime Minister has lost interest in the economy, specifically in economic performance being a variable for winning votes. We will grow at 6.5% one way or another seems to be the prevailing wisdom." You've been around for a long time. You've seen this government in action now for 10 years. Do you think there's merit in this claim? People used to accuse the UPA government of this as well, right? Treating growth as if it were on autopilot, that come hell or high water, India is going to grow at around 6 or 6.5% a year. Is there a kind of, lax mentality or lackadaisical sort of mentality in the corridors of power these days?
I can't sense it, and I do not know what prompted the author of that report to say that. I mean, or I can understand what probably did. But that's more an outcome-based assessment, right? I mean, you're looking at results in terms of growth and saying we've not grown as fast as we wanted to grow. But I think in terms of putting the ingredients of growth in place, I think this government has done a fair bit of work, and I think it's only fair that is acknowledged. For instance, all the investments that have gone into productive assets, capital expenditure on infrastructure. This is a country which was woefully short of infrastructure. And I think over the last 4-5 years, there's been a serious effort to build that infrastructure. And these are productive assets. These are not, you're not spending money on what's called revenue expenditure, and you're not, you're actually going out and building airports and ports and power plants and things like that. And the second counter I'd offer to this argument is simply the fact that, and we discussed this, over the last decade, all governments have realized that they need to have cash handout and welfare programs, and everyone, and this government is a very, very savvy government when it comes to such things. Everyone knows that you need more revenue if you're going to have to spend more money on welfare. You're just not going to be able to, and especially given the fact that this government is extremely focused on fiscal prudence. It doesn't want to bust the bank. So they know that the revenue will have to come from somewhere, and then that means you will have to push growth. I just believe that this is probably a cyclical slowdown. And I say that because, I say that a little tentatively because there are some experts who believe that it's actually structural. I don't really agree with them. And I think all the signs are that it's a cyclical one. And you need to ride this over. And unfortunately, it's come at a time when the world is also going through this period of uncertainty. You look at what happened over the weekend. Saturday, the Indian finance minister presented a budget based on a series of assumptions. A few hours later, the world's largest economy levies tariffs on 3 countries, right? I mean, changing the global economic order. And if you are one of the backroom boys or girls in the finance ministry, you're going to say, like, there go my calculations. I'm going to have to go and recalibrate several things. So it is a very, very dynamic situation.
So, Sukumar, let me just ask you one final question as we wrap up, which is, as you look at the year ahead and keeping the Indian economy in mind, what are, some of the things that keep you up at night, right? What concerns do you have about the health of the Indian economy, which might be lurking in the background and about which, we really need to kind of focus our minds?
2 things, really. One on which we've spoken about extensively, which is really the need for what are popularly called second-generation reforms. We really need to get ahead with those. It's going to require the center and the states to sit down and work together to get things done. Unfortunately, given the current political dynamic, that looks extremely difficult, but it's something that needs to be done. The first one also concerns center-state relationships, but more on the fiscal side. And it's got to do with the fact that both the center and the states have loosened the purse strings when it comes to welfare programs, when it comes to cash handout programs. And I can understand why they're doing it, because it gets them votes. And when the center does it, the states are quite happy to do it. It works in a very strange way. For instance, all indirect tax rates in India, most products in India, other than liquor and fuel, are under the goods and services tax regime, which is an indirect tax regime, GST. And there is a GST council, which has representation of the states. All states are represented in the GST. Their finance ministers are part of the GST council, which signs off on the rates. And if you look at what's happened to GST rates, and if you look at the complexities that have been introduced in it over the last few years, I think the rates have gone up in several cases. And ideally, you should be simplifying the structure and reducing the rates. And the reason why it's not happened is because the states are quite happy to sign off on tax increases because they need more money. And they get their share of revenue from this because of the devolution formula that's there. And they're quite happy to sign off on it. And so on one side, you have an indirect tax burden that's increasing. And on the other side, you have welfare programs. So I think at some point in time, there needs to be a serious debate on many of these welfare programs that are being launched, not just by the center, but also by the states. Or not just by the states, but also by the center.
My guest on the show this week is Sukumar Ranganathan. He is the editor-in-chief of the Hindustan Times. Sukumar and his colleagues have been spending the last many long days and late nights analyzing the budget in great detail. We'll link to some of their pieces in the show notes. Sukumar, thanks so much for taking the time between the budget, the Delhi elections, the upcoming Modi-Trump visit, not to mention everything else happening in the world. You have your hands full. Thanks so much for taking the time for us today.
Thank you, Milan. It was a pleasure chatting with you.
Granthamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. This podcast is an HT Smartcast original and is available on htsmartcast.com. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. It helps others find the show more easily.
For more information about the show, to support the work we do on Grant Tamasha, and to find the writing we mentioned on this week's episode, visit our website, granttamasha.com. Tim Martin is our audio engineer. Mira Verghese is our executive producer. Additional assistance is provided by Annabelle Richter. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.
This was a Hindustan Times production brought to you by HT Smartcast.
HT Smartcast.